The Lost Year, Chapter 5, Flight. Arthur frowned. He didn't particularly like this area. The last time he'd been down in this direction, he had been riding full out, taking a path around the mountains, straight to the forest of Balinor to find a rare flower for a girl. Sweet as that might sound to the outside observer, it was not a tale of love, but of a vengeful sorceress bent on getting him killed, no matter who she hurt in the process. A chain of events that had left Merlin on the patient's cot in Gaius's chambers fighting for her life. Luckily, they weren't going as far as the forest of Balinor. The smoke had been seen near the edge of the mountains, near the border with Estir. He was sort of hoping that this trip would allow him to hop across that border and head up to Ealdor to check on Merlin. But as Leon pointed out, that would likely be a bad idea. Senred was king of Estir, and part of Arthur still chafed at the thought that, in all technicality, Merlin should be working for him, having been born on his lands. He'd thought about asking her a few times, but during the mess with the dragon, Gaius had pointed out that Merlin had come to Camelot to learn to be a full-fledged physician. The court physician of Camelot was Merlin's uncle by blood. Arthur knew that. He'd wanted to go check on Huneth as well, but his duties could not be set aside at a moment's notice, while Merlin's were much more flexible. Still, she'd been gone almost a solid month, and Arthur was beginning to despair that she would ever return. Perhaps he could convince Leon to come with him in disguise. Not likely, though, since his father had picked the men for this little venture, and most were more loyal to Uther than Arthur. The mountains were cold, but not unforgivably so. They were lucky it was early spring. But still, it was slow going, mostly because none of them really knew where they were going. The map Uther had reluctantly given Arthur was old, nearly 20 years old, and only detailed the places the fortress wasn't, as none of Uther's search parties had ever found the place. The smoke, if that's what it was only so helpful with the clouds obscuring most of it. The vague impression of it led them to the very edge of the mountain range, dangerously close to Estir. Arthur frowned, calling a halt to the party as the sun vanished again behind the clouds. The dark was a dangerous enemy in treacherous mountain paths. They had yet to encounter a living soul. Arthur was starting to believe this was all a wild goose chase. Merlin was practicing her scrying. She wanted to know how accurate it could get, and had found an old map of Camelot. According to that, Gwen was currently in the lower town, likely running some errand for the royal seamstress. But she couldn't seem to find Arthur or Leon, and it made her anxiety chew on the back of her mind. Balinor had the answer, though.
You can't find them because they aren't within the area the spell is being presented,
he explained.
Things like this can happen if you try to get too specific, or if there's a shrouding ward over the place or person you're searching for.
He set a larger map of Camelot in front of her, and she held up the crystal and spoke the word. The crystal moved and landed with the tip point down. The color drained from Merlin's cheeks as Balinor's eyes widened.
Who were you focusing on?
He asked. Arthur, she said, looking down at the point of the crystal. If this was accurate, then Arthur was barely 2 passes away from them.
Pack your things, we'll leave tonight,
Balinor said, and Merlin nodded, scrambling to gather the few other things she was taking with her. Balinor turned to the stack of books he'd picked out when they first arrived. They'd only made it into the first one and weren't even halfway through that. There were 7 books in total there. He laid a hand on the first book and slid his other hand under the last one in the stack. Merlin paused in her mad scramble to watch as he began to intone a spell. It was long and complex, and his hands glowed, a bubble forming around the books as she watched. Merlin blinked as the spell ended, and Balinor brought his hands together, catching a small fall of now tiny books. They were no bigger than Merlin's palm, and would be much easier to conceal from prying eyes. "That's amazing," Merlin said as Balinor motioned for her to open her bag. She did, moving aside her mother's cloak so she could tuck away the miniature books as well. He tucked them away carefully.
They'll at the very least get you started. To break the spell, simply run a finger over the spine of the book and speak the word Seor over them. It will release the spell without too much effort. I'm sure I don't need to tell you how important it is that you keep them hidden.
Balinor said, and Merlin nodded, tucking away her scrying crystal as well. I know. He pulled her into an embrace, though they would not be separating just yet. As they packed up their things, they agreed they would head to Angad and split from there. Merlin finally heading back to Camelot, and Balinor, well, he wasn't sure where he would go. Perhaps down to Nemeth and over to Gwaint, where Kilgara was living. At least he knew if she ever needed him, Merlin had a relatively simple way of finding him. They left that night, and Merlin frowned. She didn't want Arthur to find Sciathán dragon. His father would not stop until he found a way to destroy the place, after all. Is there a second way out of this valley? Merlin asked, glancing in the direction of the smoke that would be from Arthur's campfire. Balinor nodded.
There is. What are you thinking?
He asked, and Merlin shook her head, hopping off Dancer and striding down the pass. She laid her hands on the rock wall, well away from the fortress, and spoke, the words echoing with power and bouncing again off the rocks walls surrounding them. A shudder passed through the mountain, and a cascade of rocks fell several feet away from Merlin, blocking the path Arthur would have to use to come in this direction, sending up a cloud of dust. Balinor smiled as Merlin stepped back over to her horse, brushing dust off her skirts as she went.
You really are brilliant, sweet girl,
he said as she mounted back up, grinning at him.